Good afternoon. I'm Robin Doroshow, and I'm the director of the Jewish Historical Society of the Upper Midwest. Along with our co-sponsors, World Without Genocide at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law, my alma mater, the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, and CHAIM, Children of Holocaust Survivors Association in Minnesota. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's program. There will be an opportunity for questions later in the program. To submit questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen and indicate to whom you are directing your question. Also, links to the film will be made, to both films will be made available in the chat box in the event you haven't had a chance yet to watch the films. I'd like to introduce Dr. Iris Tzafrir, who will introduce our panel members and serve as moderator of today's program. Iris is the daughter of two Holocaust survivors. Her mother, Sherry, of blessed memory, grew up in the Gyr region of Hungary, and her father, Yoshua, of blessed memory, was from Krakow, Poland. Following the Holocaust, Sherry and Yoshua built a new life in Israel. Iris's early years in a household of two parents who survived the Nazi death camps had profound impact on her worldview. The deep sadness and lack of trust in people were a few aspects of the legacy Iris's parents left her. However, Iris carries a determination to tell her family story, to use it as a story for hope, and to demonstrate how critical it is for us to be active builders of communities of inclusiveness. Iris's journey of telling her family's story started reluctantly and unexpectedly when her 6th grade son volunteered her to speak to his class about the Holocaust. Since that first experience, Iris regularly speaks in schools, businesses, houses of worship, and at community events. Iris has been interviewed by CBS Radio and for Edina's Holocaust and Genocide Awareness event. This past January, Iris was invited by Target Corporation to speak in commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Her work has been featured on media outlets, including American Public Media's On Being blog, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and the Waseca County News. Iris has a Bachelor of Arts degree in biochemistry and a doctorate in biological sciences. She is the principal owner of a consulting business helping clients build enterprise value through partnerships in the agricultural and biotechnical industries. Iris?
Thank you very much, Robin. Really appreciate the introduction, really appreciate the invitation to be part of this event today. This event and so many events like this are very important for me personally. The reason I'm here today, the reason I'm doing all the work that I'm doing is because I want to pay respect in every way possible to my parents and to family members that I never met. I really appreciate the opportunity here today. To the audience, I would like to let you know a little bit about how we're going to run this event. From this point on, anytime you're free to submit a question that is of importance to you. My request is that you try to be as brief as possible in the question that you submit, and please make sure that it is in fact in the form of a question. What we will do now is I will introduce our distinguished panel members, and each of them is going to tell us a little bit about themselves, and then we're going to move to the Q&A section of our program today. So with that, it is my honor to introduce our first panelist who will speak today, Blair Gershkow. Blair Gershkow has been editing documentaries and feature news pieces for over 40 years. His clients include 60 Minutes, the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, Oprah, ABC Nightline, and NBC Dateline. Among Blair's documentaries are The Judge and the General, which is the story of Juan Guzman, the Chilean judge who prosecuted Pinochet, Than's War, a Vietnamese refugee returns to Vietnam to find his lost family, Keeping Score, a 10-part PBS series about world-renowned conductors from Michael Tilson Thomas and the San Francisco Symphony, Saving the Bay, the story of San Francisco Bay, hosted and narrated by Robert Redford, and dozens of others. He is currently working on a documentary series about the challenges facing American cities. Blair is a native of St. Louis Park, Minnesota, and has been residing with his family, his wife, who is a St. Paul native herself, Jeanette Gittler, and their 3 children in the Bay Area since 1977. Blair, over to you, please.
Thanks so much. It's great to be part of this. I'm blessed for that. You know, doing Surviving Skokie was sort of an interesting experience of getting started. I mean, documentaries are always kind of difficult how you begin these things. And Eli Adler, who's a colleague of mine, he's a director of photography in the Bay Area from Skokie originally, had talked to me at this gathering about doing a story about his father, who was a Holocaust survivor from Poland, from Pabianice, who had sort of, you know, Eli and he had never had much of a relationship. They hadn't really grown together very much. It was very difficult. And he never knew much about his father's experiences. But father had changed a lot at some point, probably like in the 90s, I guess, it kind of started. And he wanted to do a documentary about that. And I've done a few shows about Holocaust survivors and their experiences. And I thought, well, we got to find something that's sort of different about this, or that's interesting about this, that makes it worth a documentary. That's something that people are going to want to see. So we, you know, when I found these from Skokie, that kind of started this whole thing going, and the 2 of them. And so we talked with Jack. We had a long conversation. Jack is the father, who's the star of the film, who's a wonderful person, an amazing survivor, who's now, I think, 90, but he looks about 80. So he's still doing pretty well. And we talked about doing something about it. And Skokie, I looked into Skokie and I realized that there was a lot of issues having to do with racism. Before there was anti-Semitism, and the people there had a lot of issues that I bring up in the show, so I won't talk about that too much. But at some point, Jack was invited to go to see March of Living at Auschwitz and go visit Auschwitz in Poland, and going back for the first time, because he never went back. And we decided at that point, Eli and I, that we would try to include that part, and that Eli has to be part of the film. So we kind of brought him into the film. So just being about Jack, it'd be about Jack and Eli's, the transformation of their relationship, which is, I think, is a really important thing for documentary audiences. A lot of the shows I've done, you can see involve a lot of transformation, and that's a big part of what I think people want to see in an audience. So they went to, you know, so as I looked into the Poland, to the Pabianice and into the thing about Skokie, it seemed like such an amazing story. I remembered it from when I was in college at Minnesota, and we just did a lot of research, and we went there and we talked to a lot of people, and including a lot of people who were, you know, participating with Jack and others, and against the neo-Nazis there, the threatened march. And during that, we found so many interesting parts of it, which include the legal part of it, which is a big thing. I know, and some of the audience might be interested in that, especially because it's, you know, it's all about the First Amendment and the ACLU. But also the interesting part that it seemed like Eli and Frank Collin, who was a neo-Nazi leader, had this sort of thing in common. They were together because their parents were survivors, and they went in different directions. You know, Eli became somebody who, you know, valued his family and a lot more positive. And Collin, for some reason, became this crazy enough neo-Nazi and the head of the neo-Nazis. So that seemed to be a really interesting difference that would come out in the show. Not so specifically directly, but just in their actions, you would see that. So that's part of what I was trying to get through, you know, with Eli. And then, of course, the trip, once we found out about the Skokie stuff and we talked about it and we got all the information, we spoke with different reporters who talked about it. And it was really a fascinating sort of part of the procedure for us, the process to find that out. And what's interesting that we decided when Jack was going to Poland and Eli decided to go with his father, that kind of changed even more so the relationship. And so it became a sort of emotional sort of, you know, process where Eli and Jack became sort of together. And Eli could witness where Jack was and where Jack was in the ghetto in Poland and what happened to them and how he lost his family. And then to kind of retrace the steps that Jack went to as a child. And to have Eli experience that and have Eli kind of learn from that. So in a sense, it's, you know, we've been doing a lot of film festivals, particularly Jewish film festivals over the last few years, and we always get a lot of really interesting questions and statements and educational issues and all that. So I'm proud and glad that I'm able to kind of bring this to the people of Minneapolis, with my family, my friends who live in Minneapolis, and the people in the audience too. So that's it. I await the questions. So you can go to the next person.
Thank you so much,
Welcome.
Blair. Yes. Our next panelist is Alexandra, producer at CNN International, and she spent nearly 10 years covering business and economics for CNN and its various networks, from bureaus in New York, Washington, London, and Hong Kong. Now Alexandra works independently as a writer, director, and producer of documentary shorts for nonprofits, often on subjects related to Judaism. Alexandra has produced films for the Jewish Museum of Maryland, the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C., the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society, in Washington, D.C.'s Theater Lab. Alexandra writing has appeared in the Washington Post. Her film Reawakening has been invited to screen at several Jewish film festivals around the country, including most recently the Twin Cities Jewish Film Festival. Alexandra, over to you, please.
And thank you, Aris. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and to be speaking with you and with Blair and everyone else about the issues, you know, that we are all facing and that are important to all of us. On August 12th, 2017, I was working out in a hotel gym in Western Massachusetts, and I was riding the elliptical, and I watched images on the TV of hundreds of marchers in Charlottesville carrying torches and chanting "Jews will not replace us," a Nazi slogan. And I was stunned. Never in my half century of life as an American Jew had I encountered the kind of hatred that was erupting on the screen. And the demonstration that was so brazen bore no resemblance at all to my day-to-day experience in my entire life, really, in this country. Adding to the shock, shortly afterwards, I read a blog post, which is going to be circulated in the chat, that the president of the synagogue in Charlottesville, there's only one synagogue, and the president at the time described what the synagogue had gone through that weekend of the Unite the Right rallies and how threatened the congregation had felt. And they had done things like move the Torahs out of the synagogue ahead of the rallies and ahead of the white supremacists coming to town. They moved their Saturday morning service time earlier so that it wouldn't coincide with any of the rally. The president described standing in the lobby of the synagogue, looking out the window to the street below and seeing people with semi-automatic weapons standing, just hanging out on the street corner outside the synagogue while the congregants were inside having the Saturday morning service. And he didn't know why those people were there. But Virginia's an open carry state, so they could carry their guns openly in the street. And I was an officer of my own synagogue in DC at the time, and it was unfathomable to me that I would ever encounter a situation like this. And I wondered what I would do in this situation. So what drew me to the story initially was that I wanted to tell the synagogue story, because the idea that this would be a target in 2017 was a shock. And I thought it was an important story for people to hear in this day and age. And I also thought it was important to highlight the specifically Jewish piece of the Charlottesville experiences, because the Jewish piece of it seemed to be subsumed in the broader coverage of the rallies and in this sort of general experience of hate. And as I began researching the film, I learned that the Jews of Charlottesville also felt the disconnect that I had felt between their day-to-day experience and the outpouring of hate, that white supremacy wasn't something that normally threatened their daily lives, and that the violence that came literally to the doorstep of their synagogue truly surprised them. But as they reached out into the broader Charlottesville community to build bonds and to push back against the hatred, they realized that their African American neighbors weren't surprised at all by the violence. And I heard that over and over again while I was researching. And there was a soundbite of the rabbi that I used in the film that white people in the Charlottesville community, whether Jews or non-Jews, were shocked by the violence that came there, but African Americans were not shocked by it. For them, the violence had never really gone away completely. And that realization for the Jewish community is significant, and it adds another level of surprise to their experience. So now what you've got is the Jewish community starting to wrestle with, well, what does it mean? And as they're processing their own trauma and fighting back against their own victimization, they're also wrestling with the fact that they've benefited by being perceived as white. And in the midst of wanting to push back against white supremacy and be allies with other people who are targets of white supremacy, there's the reality that their experience of white supremacy has not been the same as the experience of the African American community. So all these questions start to percolate in the Jewish community about what their role has been in contributing to racial injustice and what their responsibility is, and the whole idea of being both privileged and persecuted at the same time comes up. And Phyllis Leffler, who is a retired history professor from the University of Virginia, who did the oral history that I based the film Reawakening on, she wrote an essay, and we're going to put the link in the chat if the audience would like to read it, about Jews being insiders and outsiders, and this sort of double role of being privileged and persecuted at the same time. Rabbi Tom Goodhertz, who's the senior rabbi at the synagogue in Charlottesville, he said recently that the national reckoning with race that we're having in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, that he describes Charlottesville, that it just came to Charlottesville a few years earlier. Certainly since Charlottesville, anti-Semitism and white supremacy have grown in a way that's really troubling. There was the Pittsburgh Tree of Life shooting by a white supremacist a year later that killed 11 people. The shooting at Chabad in Poway the year after that by white supremacists killed one person. ADL, you can go to the ADL website, and their tracking has shown an increase in anti-Semitism over the last 3 years. One difference that it seems to me between Skokie and Charlottesville is that in Skokie, you had World War II veterans, whether they were Jewish or not, who were outraged at the idea of the Nazis marching because they themselves had fought the Nazis. They had served in the war, maybe even seen the camps firsthand. And there was a sense of national values. And that seems to be what's missing now, 7 decades after the war. Theoretically, in Charlottesville, you could have had a backlash that said, we fought a war against this kind of ideology. Thousands of Americans gave their lives, and this isn't what they gave their lives for. But you didn't have that. What you have instead 3 years later is people getting swept up in conspiracy theories and ideologies that are increasingly divorced from reality. And we see the extremism encroaching on the mainstream more and more. Just in the last 6 months, we've seen armed demonstrators taking their guns inside the Michigan State House to protest the COVID lockdowns. We saw the plot to kidnap the Michigan governor, and some reports said the Virginia governor too was potentially slated to be part of that, kidnapped. Newly elected members of Congress who allegedly support QAnon and other conspiracy theories. And just yesterday, thousands of people marched in Washington, D.C. to protest the election results, and among them, members of the far right. And so these are frightening developments for our democratic institutions. And I think often of a comment that journalist Skokie Roberts made a few years ago before she passed away. Having covered Washington politics for so much of her life, she was asked whether the environment was more divisive now than it had been in other generations. And she said that there had always been divisions, but what distinguished the previous generation was that they had fought World War II together. So no matter how much they disagreed, no matter how much they argued in the House or the Senate, they knew at the end of the day that they were on the same side. So the thought that I will put out there in closing is that if we are going to fight the hate around us, we have to look at what's causing the attraction to it and figure out a way to restore that sense of common purpose so that we are all on the same side again.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I would like now to turn to you, Alan Kaplan. Let me introduce you. Alan Kaplan began his legal career in 1974 as a Hennepin County attorney prosecuting serious felony cases. In 1980, Alan switched sides and over the last 40 years, he has been involved exclusively in criminal defense. His law firm, Kaplan and Tamburino, is a 7-attorney criminal defense firm representing approximately 400 clients a year on everything from traffic matters and DWI to white-collar crime and murder in the first degree. Alan's firm practiced primarily in Minnesota, although they have handled cases in both state and federal court throughout the United States. Alan has personally been involved in representing over 12,000 clients over the last 40 years. Alan, over to you, please.
Thank you. Am I on? I'm on? Okay. So in the course of representing people on criminal cases, it turns out that oftentimes we're dealing with cases which intersect with the First Amendment. And what I want to talk about at the moment is my belief that the city of Skokie, when they tried to bar the Nazis from their march in Skokie, bungled the original litigation, as a consequence of which they set the tone for things that followed therefrom. In the initial litigation brought by the city of Skokie, their prime witness was a Holocaust survivor who testified as to the negative emotional impact that allowing the Nazis to hold a parade in uniform with swastika armbands and swastika flags, the impact emotionally that that would have on him. And I think that was a mistake. If I were handling the initial litigation, I would have handled it very differently. And I would have begun by finding some members of the Jewish Defense League, which was a prominent, in that same time period, the Jewish Defense League were not unlike the Black Panther movement to the extent that they felt that one can't reason with white supremacists or neo-Nazis, that the only thing to appropriately deal with them is fighting fire with fire. In any event, what I would have done is I would have found some Jewish Defense League members whose parents were Holocaust survivors. And it wouldn't have been difficult to develop testimony from these children of survivors that their parents, for instance, were in concentration camps for X number of years, and that every minute of every day that they were there, they thought that they would be murdered. That all their possessions, all their property, their businesses, their homes were stolen. That numerous members of their families, including parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters, and children, were gassed, shot, hung, used in medical experiments, tattooed, so that the Nazis could keep accurate records on how many of the European Jewish population they had succeeded in exterminating. I would also have no trouble finding some of these Jewish Defense League children of survivors who would testify that miraculously their parents were not amongst the 6 million men, women, and children of Jewish faith who were murdered by the Nazis, that somehow they had miraculously escaped this extermination program. And that as a child, they remember their parents screaming on numerous occasions in the middle of the night, waking up from nightmares, recalling past concentration camp experiences. And that these people, these children, bore the constant reminder through their parents of living through the nightmare, with a daily reminder that every day when they looked at their arms and saw the numbers tattooed on their arms, that that was a product of this horrific experience. Furthermore, that wouldn't be difficult to find children of survivors to testify that their parents all suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome. And that from the stories that these Jewish Defense League children of survivors had heard from their parents and the parents of other survivors, that the only thing that has mitigated their parents' experience has been life in America, the land of the free, free from Nazis and their symbols. And that because these children are aware of in great detail of the suffering and losses to their own parents and other survivors, that the mere sight of people wearing Nazi uniforms with swastika armbands and carrying swastika flags parading on the streets of a predominantly Jewish community in America would actually incite these Jewish Defense League children of survivors to uncontrollable violence consistent with conversations that they have had with the children of other survivors. This type of testimony would give credence to the notion that this Nazi parade in Skokie would constitute fighting words amongst this specific audience. Now, as we all know, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution prohibits Congress from making any laws abridging freedom of speech. But it's not without exception. Fighting words or symbols which are likely to provoke physical retaliation are not protected by the First Amendment. Speech that's intended to incite violence is not protected by the First Amendment. Speech that's designed to incite an audience to commit illegal acts are not protected by the First Amendment. And the test for whether or not something would constitute fighting words, I would argue, is audience dependent. For neo-Nazis to do a march at a convention of the Ku Klux Klan would not constitute fighting words, because for that audience, that behavior would be totally acceptable. However, the situation in Skokie is, in my opinion, much to the contrary. Now, the exhibition and possession of child pornography is not protected by the First Amendment, nor are threats of bodily harm and death. And hate speech is broadly protected unless it incites one to violence. And so, in my humble opinion, a case could have been made where the march did constitute fighting words within the confines of the environment that it purported or proposed to take place in Skokie, Illinois. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that. It is my pleasure to introduce Ken Engel, our next panelist. Ken Engel's parents survived the Holocaust. As a member of the Speakers Bureau of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota, in the Dakotas, Tolerance Minnesota, the JCRC Middle East Speakers Bureau, and other platforms, Ken has given hundreds of presentations to school, college, municipal, synagogue, church, educator, and industry, business and private groups, clubs and organizations about the Holocaust. Ken's parents' experience during World War II, Israel, Judaism, and related subjects. Ken's trained thousands of survivors, children and grandchildren of survivors, community activists, and lay members on how to effectively and comfortably share their individual stories with a wide range of audiences. Ken is chair of CHAIM, a Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area group of children of second generation, or two Gs, and grandchildren, 3 Gs, and other descendants and friends of Holocaust survivors. Ken is also a member of the governing Coordinating Council of Generations of the Shoah International, GSI, a US-based group of Jewish leaders of second generation and other Holocaust-related organizations. Ken is an attorney in private practice in downtown Minneapolis. He and his sweet wife live in Minneapolis and recently welcomed their first 2 grandchildren, a beautiful boy, Quinn, and a beautiful girl, Lily. Thanks so much, Ken, for being here. Over to you.
Thank you, Irit. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, panel members. Thank you especially Blair and Alexandra for your incredible work. And also thank you, participants. I'm going to talk very briefly. I know that's unusual hearing from an attorney about something like that. But what I want to initially talk about is the timeline that we have here. With Surviving Skokie, first of all, we have a film within a film. We have a story within a story. The story within a story is the story of Jack Adler and his family and how he survived World War II. And that action against the Jews in Europe, that was state orchestrated and state sponsored. We then move to the title portion of Blair's film, where the action focuses on what happened in Skokie in 1977. And there we actually had the state opposing oppressive action against Jews. Then in Alexandra's film, we have a situation where it's actually what happened in Charlottesville was state-enabled conduct. Now, one question that you can ask is there some kind of continuum here? Well, there's a continuum. The graph is not a straight line. It goes from annihilation efforts to trying to stop people who were threatening other people, Jews, and threatening American society by insisting that they could peddle their hate speech. And then we get to Charlottesville, where we have the President of the United States equivocating between the action of the people marching and the people protesting the marching in Charlottesville on August 12, 2017. We now have a change of administration coming up January 20th of next year. Where things go from here, of course, none of us know. The hope, I believe, is that we're not going to tolerate the type of conduct that was shown in Alexandra's film of what happened in Charlottesville now over 3 years ago. And I also want to say something else. Jack Adler in Blair's film is a wonderful portrait of someone who has faced some of the worst conduct that human beings are capable of. And yet he came out on this side, not whole. Nobody who has been through, I think, what Jack went through comes out whole. I've known hundreds and hundreds of survivors, probably more than 1,000. And every one of them is not the person they were when they were growing up. They were different people, but they were affected. But there was one statement that Jack made in that film where he talked about just before he went into the ghetto. And he said that, you mean after what I've been through, I'm going to stop now? And that reminded me of a story that our dad, Engel, told me and my sweet wife years ago. Well, our dad was a slave laborer for 4.5 years. He was in the Mauthausen death camp in northeastern Austria in the last 3 months of 1945 of the war in Europe, World War II in Europe. And then after he was liberated, he went back to the family home in Munkac, Czechoslovakia, waited for his family to show. He didn't know that all but 3 members of his family had been murdered. He waited there for 30 days. Nobody shows up. He found out that a friend of his that he knew growing up, Celia Collis, who became my mother, had been sent, and he didn't know what happened exactly, but she had been sent to Budapest to be treated after her liberation from Bergen-Belsen by the British in a British military hospital in Budapest, Hungary. So he decided he was going to make the trip there to see if he could find her and see if, in effect, he could rebuild his life again. And so part of the way, part of the journey to Budapest was on this train. And he was in one train car, one rail car, and there were 2 other people in the car with him. He was still dressed in his striped prisoner outfit. And of course, he was a prisoner in Mauthausen only because he was born the wrong religion. And the other 2 people in the car were not Jewish, and they were dressed in civilian clothes, and they eyed him for a while during this trip. And finally, one of them said to Mechel, "Are you a Jew?" And he said, of course. And the person asked, well, why do you remain a Jew after everything you and your people have been through? It's obvious you were in some camp. Everything that you've been through, everything your people have suffered, why do you remain a Jew? And our dad looked back straight in the eye of this guy and he said, you mean after everything I've been through, I'm going to give it up now? So Jack's reminiscence of that reminded me of that. Speaking of Skokie in 1977, at the time I lived in Milwaukee, I knew a good number of survivors of the Shoah in Milwaukee, and I kept in touch with lots of survivors here in Minneapolis while I lived in Milwaukee. And when the news broke about what was going on with Skokie, the reactions by survivors in both cities were largely uniform. Initially, there was despair, anger, lack of hope. How can this happen here? Confusion. Why would it be allowed? Those responses were uniform. But then what filled, call it a gap, call it some absence of substance, almost uniformly, all survivors said, you know what? Number one, we're in the greatest country in the world. This country, even though it didn't take care of us before and during World War II, it largely turned its back on us while we went through what we went through in Europe. But it's taken care of us now and has taken care of us. And they did not believe, number one, that the United States or the city of Skokie or the state of Illinois would not protect survivors' interests. Now, they weren't thinking at the time necessarily. There was a clear and present danger test that was a test used by the Supreme Court until 1969 as a measure of whether or not speech should be restricted or limited. That was replaced in 1969 by the imminent lawless action test. And that was the test that was largely in force at the time of Skokie. But the survivors, again, in these two cities, almost to a person, said, you know what, not only will the American Nazi Party not prevail in this action, we've already had our revenge because our presence and the presence of our children are the best revenge we could possibly have against Hitler, and is proof that what he intended, not only did he fail at it, but here we are, and he can't do a damn thing about it. And that was a really interesting response because, especially for me, I heard it from both sides. That is, from both cities' survivor populations. And I expected something different. I expected some people would say, well, the ACLU is justified in seeking to protect the free speech or First Amendment rights of the American Nazi Party. I expected that, but I didn't really hear much of that at all from survivors. I myself was ambivalent at the time. I thought, well, as much as I hate these people, I don't know any of them. I didn't know that Frank Collins was actually Frank Cohn. I didn't know any of that at the time, but I thought, okay, these are Americans. They are entitled to First Amendment protections, assuming they don't fall outside of those protections. And I thought, well, maybe there's a case to be made, maybe there isn't. But the more I talked with survivors, the more I realized, no, I think the survivors are right on the mark, which was for a 2G, a child of a Holocaust survivor or survivors, not necessarily an easy thing to do, to admit that your parent or parents could be right about anything, kind of a variation on the Mark Twain line about how amazed he was, how much his father learned between the time Twain was 17 and 19. But I saw the wisdom in what they said, and especially when they talk about, we have prevailed. We're here. The Germans did not win. Screw them. We're not worried. It's going to work out just fine. But then, of course, we roll forward to 2017, and the nature of things, Alexandra already covered the incredible lawlessness that has been perpetrated against Jews and others from 2016 through this year. And it also illustrates a lesson that Jews have learned unfortunately, very painfully, is that if one minority isn't safe, no minority is safe. So I guess the question is, there's a lot to learn here. Nobody knows where we go from here, but we have a certain resolve, I think, that portions of the population are exhibiting and recognizing, which is we have to stand up to this type of thing. We also have significant portions of the population that say it's okay. We want to protect our inherent or our historic rights of being on top. We're not going to give that up. We're going to fight to some end to protect those rights. We still have those major divisions in this country. Is what the survivors went through, is it an educational lesson for things? Maybe it is, because the United States did not follow the path that Germany followed after Hitler came to power on January 30th of 1933. Didn't even come close, thank goodness. But there's still this major division, this partisanship that has increased the distance between people and increased the lack of sense of we're in this together. And when that sense returns, maybe then we'll be able, we as a nation, we as a people will be able to move forward. But until then, it's going to be, I'm afraid, a long and very rocky road. And there's going to be a lot of heartache, I'm afraid, along the way. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Ken. I would like now to turn to the question and answer portion of our program. And I would like to start with a question that touches upon a couple of questions that came from our viewers, and it touches upon social media. So social media is a key medium for us to get our agenda across. It is also the key medium for hate propagators to get their agenda across. A meeting on your calendar showed up with Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook and Jack Dorsey of Twitter. I would like to start with you, Blair. What would you like to bring up with them? What is your top ask from them and why? You're on mute. If you can unmute, yeah, perfect. Nope, you need to unmute again.
There you go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a difficult. It's interesting. I think what Ellen just said, I believe, citing the examples is a really good point about that, and I certainly think that they need to be the more responsible about that. I mean, I live in San Francisco. I live outside of San Francisco, and a lot of these high-tech companies are here, and those people are very prominent citizens in the Bay Area, and they get a lot of pressure. And I do believe that the Trump administration and the people who follow him have been trying to manipulate social media for their own. And I think that unfortunately it's been sort of successful. I think they're afraid to like mute them or to not allow them to have more say than they already have. And that's a problem. But it is difficult. I think maybe that's a good legal question too. It's like, how far can you go? And I don't know the answer to that. I think that's why I would leave to Alan and and Ken about that, because I think that how much, I mean, that's just part of the same thing. I mean, what point does social media become part of even the legal part, become something forbidding things to happen or making things outlaw? So I don't really know the answer to that. I guess I leave it to those who are smarter than me to figure out.
Thank you. If I could go next to Alexandra, then to Dr. Kennedy, then to Ken, then to Alan.
Sure. Okay, it's quite possible I'm the least technologically savvy person on this panel, but I will say that there has to be, I know there's the debate about, whether they're publishers or whether they're just creating a platform, and to what extent is it right that they monitor the content? There has to be some way of monitoring lies and things that are not fact-based on there, that you can't use a platform like that to spread falsehoods and have this perception among the public that this is the equivalent of a newspaper or a legitimate editorial organization. So that, and the other thing is spreading hate. And I send it back to the First Amendment lawyers, but some way of balancing, what is a threat and what threatens people's public safety versus freedom of speech. And I don't know the legalities of that, but I know there are people who do.
Dr. Kennedy?
I think that's a terribly difficult question. And we do know that Holocaust and genocide organizations and institutions around the world have successfully lobbied Facebook and Twitter, and they will no longer post genocide, Holocaust, I shouldn't say genocide, they will no longer post Holocaust denialism. Now, it just means it goes somewhere else. There's no way, given the multiple levels of technology, that hate is going to go away from social media. I don't believe that the prohibition against it will make it disappear. I think there has to be a very strong counter movement that strongly voices support for those who are marginalized, that strongly encourages human rights for all, that does programs widely, particularly beginning with young people, that focuses on raising that next generation of human rights leaders.
Alan?
I don't know that it's a legal issue more than it's an issue of social responsibility. And interestingly enough, Sacha Baron Cohen, who's commonly known as Barat or Ali G, and in those characters, he comes off as being buffoonish. But Sacha Baron Cohen gave a speech at an annual meeting of APEC, where he went after Facebook and Twitter. It was one of the most articulate speeches I have ever seen or heard. And I was blown away by how articulate he is. It's something everyone who has any concern with this particular issue should watch. I mean, he lays out the blueprint of what ought to be done in regards to the social responsibility of Facebook and Twitter in dealing with this issue. That's it.
Okay. Ken?
Thank you. I want to largely echo what Ellen and Alan talked about. And the speech that Alan was referring to was Baron Cohen's speech to the ADL in November of 2019. It's very powerful. The initial question was in terms of approaching the CEOs of the social media platform controllers and asking them about how are you going to address these issues. Well, first of all, in terms of First Amendment rights, with some rare exceptions, some states expand individuals' First Amendment rights, but the First Amendment itself doesn't protect an individual's free speech if it doesn't involve a government official. And that's somewhat of a problem. And I think also keeping in mind that these social media platforms, their main catalyst is profitability. Whether they resonate to social responsibility, to mores, to showing or making a good example or exhibiting a good example for the rest of the societies that they serve, I don't know. I guess my question would be for those people who actually control social media companies, the major ones, I guess I would ask the question, knowing it's a relatively naive question, which is, what are you going to do to promote the well-being of your audiences? And see what they have to say. It may be a soft pitch. It may have no force or effect to it, but I think that's the question that I would ask them with fingers crossed. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We have a couple of other questions that have come through. One of the questions is regarding what happened in Skokie. I think, Alan, this is probably best started with you, where an audience member said that they believe the fighting words argument was made in court and dismissed. Can you comment on that or confirm that, please?
I have a very quick answer. No, I'm not sure. My understanding was that the actual litigation involved a Holocaust survivor, the initial litigation, who just talked about the emotional impact that it would have. And the determination by the courts was, well, that's not enough.
Can I just say one thing? Can I answer that for a second? What's kind of interesting against all that backdrop that we've been talking about is that there is a belief, of course, with all this, that the truth will always come out in these kind of things. I know it sounds like somewhat naive, but in the sense, I think John Milton had said that, you know, that any kind of with a confrontation with falsehoods, the truth always comes out. And there is this sort of sense that we're so consumed with the hate and with so much of the negative stuff, which we totally understandably are, but somehow the truth does come out, and almost like, and one could even see the election and maybe say a little bit, could find it's scary that 72 million people supported Trump, but it's that the truth did come out, or at least that the people against him did succeed. So maybe if nothing else, that's an interesting angle that has been taken by people far more intelligent than me.
You know,
I'd like to add something to that, if I may, and that is how important it is to end impunity for this kind of hate speech and incitement. And that's why I referenced Tanya Gersh's case. We know that incitement was used in so many different ways during the Holocaust, and Julius Streicher paid with his life for that, for the newspaper that he published. But people also were put on trial and sentenced for incitement during the Rwandan genocide. This is for incitement, not for actually killing anyone. And to begin to end impunity for a hate at that level, whether it's through the radio, like it was in Germany and Rwanda, or online, like it was for Andrew Engel, begins to send a message that this is not okay. You do this, you will have consequences.
you know, am I on?
Yes, go ahead, Alan.
Back to the Skokie litigation. I don't think that whoever was doing the litigation, you know, they may have mentioned fighting words, but there's a difference between mentioning that and putting on actual witnesses who will attest to the fact that because of the life experiences that they have had, that this would precipitate violence on their part towards those Nazis. And I think that type of thing that type of presentation would have made a big difference.
Thank you.
Can I
We
add
have-
one thing
Yeah,
to
Please,
Ellen-
Alexandra, I was just about to ask you a question.
Okay,
Go-
I just wanted to add something to what Ellen said about showing that there are consequences. There is an organization, and I will put the name of it in the chat so that people can Google and read if they want to, called Integrity First for America, that is bringing a lawsuit against the organizers of the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. And the purpose of it is to show that there are both legal and financial consequences to organizing it. And I don't know all the details of their argument, but they do claim that there was violence intended and that it was a conspiracy. It wasn't a freedom of speech issue. So I'll put the name of that organization in the chat right now.
Thank you, Alexandra. I have two questions related to the films. So actually, Blair, maybe we jump over to you, and Alexandra, I'd like to come back to you, please. We have a question, Blair, from a viewer, and he wants to know if in the course of preparing the movie, if you have any information that you glean as to why or how Collins became so involved with neo-Nazis when his parents were camp survivors.
Yeah, well, the story there is that his father was Polish and got in trouble for some things or another. It was put into Dachau in the early 30s, and people then were not. That's before the Nazis were killing everybody, and he came to Chicago. He married a non-Jewish woman in Chicago, and so and I think that I've seen interviews. His grandparents won't even. They could not figure out why what happened to him. His father was so ashamed of what his son was doing. We did reach out to him. He's still around, and we called him, and he lives in western Wisconsin. I think it's and he's gotten out of the whole. He doesn't talk about it, doesn't want anything to do with the whole thing and talk about it and all that. He's into paganism. It's kind of an odd sort of thing what he's happened to him. But as a psychiatrist, Dr. Rosenberg said in our show, I mean, I brought him in because a lot of the survivors would not speak about their experiences. And I wanted somebody to talk about it and who could kind of, help them get out what they were really would have said. And he had interviewed a lot of people for his work. And part of it was he believed that, that Colin, as I said in the show, was sort of needs a need for attention and a need for somehow, and who knows for what reason, sort of a anti-Semitic Jew. I mean, it's difficult to figure out, and that's something that we never quite could, get it. We asked that from Rosenberg, but never quite got the right answer.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Candy, do you have a comment or a build about that?
Just a very quick one relative to Frank Collin and the relationship with his family. Anyone hear of Stephen Miller?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that was an easy shot.
Yeah.
His family has largely disowned him for his conduct, even before when he was working working with Senator Sessions, before Sessions joined the Trump administration. Miller has a long history, and it's everything that I've read is that his family has no understanding how he got to where he is. It may be similar to where Colin's family views him.
Thank you. Alexandra, we have a question for you. In the course of making your film, whether you had any direct contact with neo-Nazis or white supremacists, and if so, can you share from these experiences with us?
Yeah, no, I did not. I mean, I had contact with the Jewish community in Charlottesville, but not with the neo-Nazis or white supremacists directly.
Okay.
And there's no representation. I mean, I'm former journalist and trained in showing both sides. There's no representation in the film or in any of the material that I collected that would show the neo-Nazi side of, or the white supremacist side to this.
Yeah, if I could just respond to that too, just a second, that that it's interesting with Colin that once he failed and once he kind of chickened out at the end and decided not to march because he was afraid of getting beat up by the JDL guys and all that, the organization sort of fell apart. And I don't know how that helps us look ahead with, like Ethel's talking about, or Ellen's talking about, the sense of maybe these things kind of come and go depending on what's going on in our society and all that. But that thing kind of fell apart really quickly and he left and went to jail for other reasons. But so that's an interesting sort of, you know, byproduct of this whole, this hate.
Yeah, thank you for that. We just have a few moments left. I wanted to kind of do a final round among all our panelists. And if you could tell us from your personal experience, from people that you have worked with over the years, from all of these extremely disturbing events, and disturbing is a very minor way to put it, that have taken place in the United States since the Holocaust. What are the lessons that you would like to share with the audience? Is there anything positive that can come out of it that you would like to leave with our audience today? Dr. Kennedy, you've definitely given us some things to follow up on and call for action, and I really, really appreciate that. I think those are very, very clear in all of us, you know, kind of a list of things for us to do. I would like to open it to all of our panelists and say, what would you like to leave with us? Hopefully positive, but it doesn't have to be. Blair, maybe we start with you, please.
Well, you know, I think one thing that I heard from Ken a little bit, and I think that, and I appreciate what that point, and with Ellen also, the sense that the survivors are sort of dying off. Jack Adler, who's like in his 90s, and a friend of mine's mother is 95, who's a survivor, still alive, and she had COVID and she still survived, believe it or not. But I mean, they have this incredible strength to survive, but they're dying off. And there's a concern, which is kind of a common thing, that how far, you know, how do we keep it going? How do we keep reminding people? And I know that schools, and Ellen can speak probably better this than me, are not so, you know, they don't spend much time talking about that. When I showed the program at film festivals, oftentimes students will come and they'll talk about that. Sometimes they had, you know, and their students are not just Jewish, and they had no idea what was going on. You know, that always just shocks me.
Alexandra?
I think if there is a silver lining, it's that it is bringing communities, different groups within communities together to fight hate, sort of under the best of circumstances, you know, not uniformly across the board, but, you know, you do see in communities like Charlottesville, and I think it was mentioned that it happened in Skokie too, that you have interfaith organizations working together and different groups, different faiths, sort of hearing and seeing each other's pain. And it's not that each one is siloed in their own experience, but that they are working together. So if there is a silver lining, you know, it is that the sense of we're all in this together and that you need to join forces to combat it.
Thank you. Ken?
Blair made a reference to truth and how getting out the truth is one way that we can combat these things. I think that's a variation on the old sunlight is the best disinfectant. I happen to think, since truth is a rather elusive animal, the more information, the more educational efforts that we can put out, such as this presentation, this program, the more that's done, the better off I think we're going to be. And I think the other thing that can be done is that these oppressors of every stripe, their conduct comes down more or less to bullying. Lots of different kinds of bullying. And what are the two things that deter bullying? First of all, is that they don't have the person they were trying to victimize any longer. They're not available for any reason. The second is that there are consequences imposed. And this is echoing what Ellen said. There are consequences imposed for their conduct, and they're real consequences, and they hurt. They're so significant that they are going to cause, one hopes, a change in the behavior, not just in the oppressor, in the bully, but those people in the bully's community, to make it known to them, you want to try this? Guess what? You're not living in a vacuum. There will be consequences for what you're doing. I think those two efforts side by side, to the greatest legal extent possible, I think those are things we should also be pursuing.
Thank you. Ellen?
I mentioned the power of youth, and I think that we often give lip service to that, but we truly must make a commitment. I think most of us on this screen are involved in boards and organizations. Get young people on those boards, hire young people, mentor them, show them the path to advocate for human rights, whether it's in law, medicine, in the arts, whatever it might be. This is the time to reach broadly and engage with young people. Look at what they've been doing to address the climate catastrophe. Young people want to see a different world. Bring them in and get them started very actively and be a mentor.
Thank you.
Here, here.
Oh, Alan, if we could hear from you before we turn it back to Robin, please.
Thank you. You know, I have, unfortunately, a more pessimistic view. My view is that after the Holocaust, when the world saw all those pictures of piles of bodies and realized the magnitude of the Holocaust, the Jews sort of got a pass for 70 years or so. I think that there has always been anti-Semitism, but I think in the 70 years following the Holocaust, it was latent. And I think that past and that party is over. And it is now, anti-Semitism is now much more overt throughout Europe, in America, and you know, it's a problem.
Yes. Thank you all very much. And let me turn this back over to you, Robin.
Thank you, Iris, and thank you all for being on our panel today. Thank you everyone who's in attendance here today for making this event happen. And also thank you to our community organizations, and thank you all for supporting us. Enjoy the rest of your day.